Media Prime TV, as announced on our different platforms. As to our guest for tonight, we are going to be having an exclusive one with one of Cameroon's finest, doing the nation so proud out there at the international level. We see him crisscrossing continents and nation, actually carrying and bearing the flag of this nation so high. He is back in the country, and it's a privilege for my Media Prime TV, the pointer to be precise, to have him with us in our studios out here in the nation's economic capital, Fangudrombange, to be precise. Our guest for tonight is Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, who is the Senior Associate for Africa and Regional Director at the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. He also owns media outfit that is operating in Bamenda, and runs a foundation that has been touching lives across Africa and Cameroon, to be precise. So many lives have been touched through his foundation. I'm talking about the Christopher Fomunyoh Foundation. Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh is our guest for tonight's edition of The Point, and I am so glad, excited to have him on this platform for the very first time. Good evening, Doctor. We're glad to have you.
Good evening, and thanks for having me, and congratulations for all the work that you've done in such a short space of time to get my Media Prime to where it is today, and to make The Point one of the flagship programs for the station, but also one that is listened, I understand, by well over 80% of the Anglophone population in this country. Let me also say what a delight it is to be here after you launch your book, your wonderful book, More Than Justice, for someone who, through law school in Guayaquil at the time, took the law of equity. That struck a chord with me. So I thought I should, having missed the book launch, I should come and get my autographed copy of your book. But congratulations for that.
Thank you.
I also want to take the opportunity to wish a happy International Women's Day to all the women of this country, our moms, our aunties, sisters, spouses, daughters, nieces, for all they do for humanity. Of course, it was March 8th, but we have to celebrate our women through the entire month of March and through the entire year, just because of what they do and the resilience that the African woman brings to humanity as a whole. So it's a true delight to be here, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much. We are actually very glad to have you on this platform, and we hope that what you're going to be telling our televiewers is also going to enrich their knowledge on what we the subjects that we're going to be touching this night. I'll start with your involvement in what is happening in Ukraine and Russia. I'm sure the whole African Cameroon was taken aback when you were given that privileged position to come into the grain process, supply process to African nations. First, tell us how you got involved into this whole process as a Cameroonian and an African. This is a war that is taking place between Ukraine and Russia, and from nowhere we hear that you are involved. How did you get involved?
Well, that's a very good question, because as we speak, this is the one war that is a threat, not just to Russia, that's not just to Ukraine that's been attacked by Russia, but it's a threat in many minds to the possibility of a third world war. Just given the alignments with all of NATO, which is all of Europe, Western Europe, and the United States backing Ukraine. And of course, you add to that China and South Korea, some of the democracies in Southeast Asia backing Ukraine, and Russia, of course, being backed by North Korea and China. And so it's a huge issue what's happening today in Ukraine. And President Zelensky, Volodymyr Zelensky, had his people reach out to me. They must have done their homework. They reached out to me in 2022, at the time when the United Nations and Turkey had brokered a deal to allow both Russia and Ukraine to export grain through the Black Sea to help alleviate food insecurity around the world. Because this war is hitting Ukraine, which, you know, for many years, for decades, was the 5th largest producer of grain or supplier of grain to the whole world. And so when you have that kind of dynamics, it impacts the rest of the world. And food insecurity, famine, risk of famine and hunger have become real. And so that's when the UN got in with Turkey, and they mediated that effort, which led to the Black Sea Agreement, signed in July of 2022. And this agreement, President Zelensky then thought that for him or for Ukraine to be able to fully implement this agreement, it was important for him to set up an international committee for the prevention of global hunger that would help advise how Ukraine could best meet its humanitarian goals. And that's how I got in. When his people reached out to me, I said, of course, I am a humanitarian at heart. And in this kind of situations, given what this means for Africa as a continent, given the threats of famine and hunger and food insecurity that we face because of some of the conflicts, because of climatic conditions, because of the fact that in many cases we're still dealing with very rudimentary agriculture that doesn't allow us to feed our people and our neighbors. If I got involved in this, I could play a constructive role. And I've been very pleased. Okay.
You've been very pleased. You were in Ukraine in November 2023. Yes. And then we saw you in Kenya 2023 March. Yes. And you just came back from Nigeria. Yes, you went to... what did you go to do in Kenya and recently in Nigeria?
First, I was in Ukraine in November 2023 for the second Global Food Security Summit, which was an assembly chaired by President Zelensky in the presence of a number of heads of governments to talk, and international organizations, to talk about how they could continue to make sure that the world wasn't exposed to food insecurity. It also happened to be the 90th anniversary of the Holodomor, which is that experience that Ukraine went through 90 years ago, when over 3 million Ukrainians were starved by the Stalinist regime in Russia, starved to death. Yeah. And so every year in November, Ukraine has this commemoration of that horrible experience. And it so happened that even while we were there for this second global summit, that was the weekend, November 23rd weekend, when Russia sent over 100 drones and missiles into Kiev, the capital city of Ukraine. So I had this, I wouldn't say opportunity to live through that experience and to get a sense for myself what the people of Ukraine go through on a daily basis in this very uneven conflict. I was in Kenya in March 2023 because Kenya received a delivery, a shipment of 30 million tons of grain from Ukraine to help alleviate hunger and famine in the 3 northern regions of Kenya, which in the past 5 years have experienced unprecedented drought because of climatic conditions. I mean, this is not through any fault of theirs, but we had people dying in villages in Kenya. We had cattle, people losing their cattle, which was their source of livelihood, and entire villages being displaced because of the famine. And so when Ukraine made this gesture of sending a shipment of 30,000 tons, they required that one of the goodwill ambassadors should go to Ukraine to oversee or be present during the delivery. And I was there in a ceremony presided over with the Vice President of Kenya and various members of the diplomatic corps that had contributed to this effort to see the World Food Program receive the grain and ensure that the distribution will be made to those communities that were most impacted. And the last report I read on this said that close to 1 million Kenyans had been fed with the grain that had been delivered through this process over a period of 6 months' time. And then just last month, I was in Nigeria, Abuja, Nigeria, to see Nigeria receive 25,000 tons that were delivered in Port Harcourt, in this, the seaport of Port Harcourt in Nigeria, and that will go probably to help communities in northeastern Nigeria that have been impacted by the Boko Haram crisis and that are now exposed to issues of famine and hunger.
Now, what can you say is the net impact of the war that has been going on between Ukraine and Russia on Africa? And what does it tell that Africa at this point still faces food issues because of a war that is fought out of the continent?
Well, I would say that you know, the feeling of the impact of food insecurity is not just African. Okay. There was also a shipment that was sent to Yemen in the Middle East. And the list of countries that are lining up and asking for help is quite high. And even in, you know, in Western Europe or in North America, where issues of famine are not arising, there's been an increase in food prices. You know, yeah. And so globally, the world is being impacted by this conflict. The second thing I would say is that Africa is a fertile continent. We still have some of the most fertile areas or lands on the globe, but we haven't industrialized our agriculture. And you know, I'm from the Northwest, and people still go to the farms when they can with cutlasses and hoes. Yeah. That may allow them to feed their immediate families, but it doesn't give them the capacity, the excess capacity to be able to feed their neighbors and other villages and even export their crops. And so for me, as an African, one of the ideas that I have at the back of my mind is that when this war is over, various African countries should be negotiating with countries such as Ukraine and asking them the question, how did you, a small Ukraine, industrialize your agricultural production to the point where you're the 5th largest supplier of wheat or grain to the rest of the world? And if we can begin to invest more in industrializing our agriculture, I think we'll get to that point. Yeah,
because I was going to ask you that what would account for the fact that we have heads of states who know how capital agriculture is to the nations and its people, and for these years have not been able to invest as much as we are talking about today, and for us to have waited for a war to see its consequences on African nations to start thinking about this. What would account for this situation?
You know, it's not even just the heads of states. The African Union, the African Union has actually adopted a resolution on agriculture. The African Union resolution required that countries invest at least 10% of their budgets into agriculture. Yeah. It's on the books, but as tends to happen on our continents, there are a lot of good resolutions that get passed at summit meetings, even summits of heads of states, that don't get implemented. And today we're seeing the consequences. And we're not even having other African countries being able to sufficiently feed themselves and then export to other African countries. We also, and on the second point, we also have the network of communications, of transportation. And so even at the time, when I still remember the time when Cameroon had food self-sufficiency, but we just didn't have the infrastructure to be able to export to other countries that need help. If you look at the countries in our neighborhood, for example, Chad, or the other countries in the Sahel, they could use a lot of help from the excess production of agriculture in our own country. But do we have the infrastructure to be able to do that? So there's a lot that I'm learning through this entire process. And my hope is that as we collectively as Africans come to the realization that agriculture is important, that we'll be able to put in place, our governments will be able to put in place the policies that can allow us to, to increase domestic production first, and then secondly, to put in place the infrastructure that can facilitate exportation to other African countries and to the world at large.
Now, when you go to Kenya and recently Nigeria, I know you have been moving to other nations. Do you talk with the leaders in this country on the need for what you just said? I'm talking about heavy investment in the sector, agricultural sector.
Yes.
You discuss? Yeah?
Yes, we talk about that. And you know, the beauty of some of those conversations is that when you talk to leaders, they nod, and they say, we understand, and you're right, we agree with you. But the problem is just, why don't they deliver on those things that even they agree on? And I think when we get to other segments about the politics of the continent, citizen engagement and the ability to hold leaders accountable, the needs for political parties to have platforms and run on platforms, and then while in office, try to meet and respect the promises that made to the electorate, that we can discuss a lot of these things.
Which is where we are going to be heading. I want us to look at democracy in Africa. Yeah. Your net assessment of our level of democracy, and finding out why it is difficult for Africans to be satisfied with what they have been served with so far by their leaders in the name of our democracy. Take the situation of Senegal. What is not right with Senegal?
It's a very interesting question because just about 10 days ago, about 10 days ago, February 29th, I was on a panel in Washington, D.C.
Okay. Yes,
with Mo Ibrahim of the Mo Foundation out of London, and with a civic leader from Burkina Faso and other African experts. And that was the question for discussion. Democracy right now on the continent is going through a lot of hardship. There's been a lot of backsliding. I would almost say it's on life support.
Yes.
It needs a lot of energy, oxygen, renewed energy and oxygen. We have to be very honest about ourselves and our assessment. Because I remember, you know, in the early 90s, apartheid collapsed in South Africa. Everyone jubilated. Namibia had its independence. It was a source of celebration. Nelson Mandela came out of prison, and Nelson Mandela came out of prison and got eventually elected president of South Africa. There was a lot of effervescence. Yeah. Multipartyism got introduced in a number of countries. We had very exciting elections in Cameroon, here in Cameroon in 1992. The first ever competitive elections in Cameroonian history, 1992. So a lot of good things were happening, and there was a lot of enthusiasm that democracy would take root. Unfortunately, we've seen a lot of backsliding. We've seen governments that have come to power even through elections that are not delivering to their citizens. We've seen a lot of citizen disaffection, and now we're seeing a series of coups d'etats, something that we thought was now of the past. We're seeing a new generation of coup makers coming in, telling the population that democracy is not delivering and that we can offer better, but finding a way to get themselves in power, even though I know, and even some of them know, that military regimes have never delivered democracy or democratic governance.
Now, let's talk about Senegal. You follow very closely what is happening in Senegal. What would be an explanation to the attempt that was made on a democracy that for some time has been celebrated by the world? I'm talking about Senegal's democracy.
Sure. I mean, your question is right on the mark, because for many years Senegal had always been cited as a success story with regards to democracy on the African continent, not just in Francophone Africa, but across the continent. And I would say its democracy has been tested in the past 2 or 3 years. First, it was tested in 2012, when President Abdoulaye Wade, president at the time, wanted to seek a third term. And the Senegalese came out and said no. And so they survived it, and everyone thought their democracy came out stronger. But in the last 2 years, we've seen a lot of violence. First, there was some controversy about whether President Macky Sall would seek a third term, and then he came out and said he wasn't interested in a third term. But the controversy around the pre-election period has really almost dented Senegalese democracy. The brand, as of today, is no longer what it was a few years ago. However, the silver lining in Senegal, as I see it, has been the performance of the Constitutional Council of Senegal, the equivalent of the Constitutional Court. The fact that the justices could take their stance and read the law as it's written, both in the spirit and in the wording of the law, to say that the president could not extend his term, that the president must leave office by April 2nd, and that presidential elections must hold before the president leaves office, was a victory for the judiciary of Senegal. Secondly, the mobilization by Senegalese civil society. I mean, it's been remarkable that academics at the university, independent personalities, jurists, civil society coalitions, political parties came together and said, we want our constitution to be respected, we want to hold our elections, we want our elections to be inclusive. And my sense is that now that we have an election date for March 24th, Senegal is on the uptake, it's it's going to come out of this with its democracy stronger, and the credit for that strength will go to the Senegalese people and the institutions that held firm that the constitution and the electoral code of the country must be respected.
Now, some persons attempted to believe that maybe President Macky Sall is trying to play on the strings of maybe some foreigners who may want to seek their interest in the nation. Do you think he's doing that because he wants to stay in power, or to serve the interests of some persons who may be out of Senegal?
You know, Africa is part of the world.
Yes.
So we cannot treat Africa as if it was an island in some isolation. And so I would be the first to recognize that global politics, geopolitics count, relationships matter in international politics. Countries have got interests and sometimes want to protect those interests in some ways. We can't deny that. But we should also not overestimate. We should also not overestimate the impact of personal relationships. We should not believe that every African leader who underperforms, who does bad things for his people, is doing so at the behest of the international community. Okay. Because we've also seen African leaders who have done good things. And those good things were done by leaders who were also known internationally, who may also have had people whispering in their ears to do things that will not help their people. And so I think that when an African leader succeeds, they should be given their credit on the merit, and when they fail, they should take blame for their failure.
Let's look at the civic responsibility and engagement of Senegalese civil society. You just cited the case of lecturers in university and across the board. Everybody showed an interest in what was happening at the helm of the nation. But there is always this tendency to say, okay, French-speaking nations are not so engaged. How would we explain what is happening in Senegal, where everybody stands up? It did not just start with President Macky Sall. We saw them stand up against the former President Wade. Yes.
It's been remarkable to see, because even artists,
everybody,
musicians, filmmakers became part of the conversation. And I think it speaks to a level of civic awareness that citizens feeling emboldened, empowered to say, I must stand up and speak for my people and speak for my rights. Interestingly, you talk about Francophone Africa, and in the past 2 decades or so, a lot of the backsliding that we've seen has been in Francophone Africa. But we cannot forget that in the early 90s, it was Benin Republic that launched the phenomenon of national conferences. And because of what was done in tiny Benin Republic, General Kerekou, who was a military general who had been in power through a coup for decades, was able to relinquish power. And President Nesufo Soglo, a civilian, got elected into office to serve as president, and Benin began the process of peaceful transitions in its politics. And what happened in Benin impacted Francophone Africa and also impacted the rest of the continent. Because I can count between 1990 and 1994, 17 autocratic regimes that have lost power on the African continent, many of them from Francophone Africa. So I think it's a question of citizen awareness and citizens being reminded that they own real political power in their respective countries. And it's incumbent on them to stand out and be counted, to make sure their rights are respected by politicians and political elites, and to not for sale or not sell those rights because of ethnic affiliation or because of benefits or prebends from the powers of the day.
Okay. Good evening to you, Dudu, Losa, and Eduardo, and Tabe, Tetu. You guys are all watching us on using our social media handle. And to all of you guys are watching, please, if you have a question for a doctor, just drop the question. I'll read them out in the course of the program. Yes, Doctor, let's look at what is happening still in West Africa, Francophone Africa. Surprisingly, the case of Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso, Guinea to some extent. How do we explain the upsurge, the trending of coup d'etats in the 20th century?
It's really a sad state of affairs. And I'm hoping that with the Senegal story,
21st century, rather.
Yeah, 21st century.
Yeah.
It's a state of affairs. And I'm hoping that the Senegal story will change the narrative with regards to what's happening in Africa. And why citizens need to know that they have the power to bring about change, even if they don't go through a military coup.
Okay.
Because a military coup, while it may give short-term gratification, and I can understand young people who feel the frustration that their lives have not changed, who feel that they have no opportunities for them, who feel that one set of government has been in power forever and is perpetuating themselves, and they've captured the state, they've captured the public good, and they're reserving it for a small minority. I can understand the frustration of these young people cheering the military on and saying, knock them off. But history has proven that coups rather are the antidote to democratic governance, that it takes a toll on the nascent institutions that we have. And what we should be looking out for are ways to capitalize on what has been accomplished, rectify and improve on that, to make sure that the change of power becomes a normal process of governance in our respective countries. Those coups are very unfortunate, especially in a country like Niger, that was on the uptick, that had actually made incremental progress on issues of security, on issues of child nutrition, on issues of girls' education. All of the indicators that President Bazoum had put in place in 2 years have been undermined by the military coup of last July. And if you look at the statistics on Niger, in terms of Boko Haram and terrorist attacks, in terms of standards of living, they've all declined. And it's difficult for me to imagine that a regime that comes to power through the bayonet and the bullet of the gun is all of a sudden going to create a process where people can express themselves freely and through the ballot process. No. So they're really a step back.
Okay, it's a step back according to you, Doctor. But how would we explain when you look through the military leaders in Burkina Faso, in Mali and in Niger and in Guinea, they are turning towards the east. I don't know, what can Russia provide these nations today? You
know, realistically, you can't stop a government from building its relationships. I would be the first to also encourage every government to establish relationships with countries that could provide benefits to the country and to its citizens. Many countries such as Turkey, for example, now have relationships across this continent that they didn't have before. China has improved its relationships with various African countries, and that's to their credit, and that's fine. But when you have a country that offers what all it offers, it's a group of mercenaries or military assistance, that's not what the countries need the most. And the East-West relationships existed even in the Cold War era. In the Cold War era, there were African countries that were pro-West, and there were African countries that were pro-communist at the time, pro-East. So this is a phenomenon that has existed. My only advice to various countries would be build relationships that can bring meaningful improvement in the lives of your citizens. Hiring mercenaries isn't going to do that. Signing contracts just to get arms and not agricultural tools, for example, or agricultural tractors, as we were talking about agriculture at the beginning, isn't going to benefit your citizens. And so you can have mercenaries protect you at the State House, at the presidency, but at some point, ultimately, when the citizens of your country don't see an improvement in their well-being, they're going to ask you to leave, and those mercenaries with them.
What is the future of this nation? Take Guinea, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger. You see them coming out of where they thought they were before. Or you see a bright future through these guys, and you are someone who actually understands how political issues operate in Africa. Do you see these guys easily handing power to democratic leaders?
I don't think so. I don't think voluntarily they would. Okay. I've met with some of them. I met with now General Ndumoya in Guinea, and we had a face-to-face conversation. I've talked to senior officers, military officers in many of these countries. I follow developments. India has got offices in some of the countries. I think, and that's where the regional body ECOWAS is trying to come in, to see if they can work in partnerships with these regimes, to say, first, military regimes are an anomaly, because opinion polls show that 70%, at least 70% of Africans aspire to living in democratic societies. 70 Africans are very committed to their rights and freedoms and should be allowed to enjoy those rights: freedom of the press, freedom of association, freedom for political parties to form, civil society. And you can't do that under a military regime. And those regimes should be considered the anomalies that they are, and steps should be taken to return those countries to a state of normalcy, which is a state of democratic governance.
Okay. So you don't see any. What if they decide not to hand apart to normalize the situation, like you are saying, and their decision to leave ECOWAS, they are also fronting for a new form of government that would see the three of them possibly attract others to join them. Is that feasible? Does it speak well for the population?
You know, you can write short-term propaganda. It can only take you that far.
Okay.
Some of these experiments have been tested before. My one regret is that while they're testing various experiments in relationships and all of that, that ordinary citizens are getting crushed in the process. We've been down this path before. And I would just ask one simple question. How do you replace a military regime that's underperforming?
Through another coup.
Exactly. Through another coup, which just introduces an element of instability, which Africa doesn't need at this time, which our countries went through between the 60s and the 80s when coups were a la mode, so to speak. And so why in the 21st century do you build for yourself a whole network of instability that is going to negatively impact your citizens, knowing that the only way to improve on the system that you're putting in place is through counter coups and more violence and more bloodshed? We don't need that. And so my wish, my hope, is that ultimately at some point wiser heads would prevail. I saw that recently at the last head of state summit for ECOWAS, General Yakubu Gowon, who was one of the founding fathers of ECOWAS, wrote an open letter to the 15 heads of states of West Africa to say, on the issue of the Sahel, take another look. General Gowon has even offered himself at his age, he's getting close to 100, to go to those countries to make the case as the founding father of ECOWAS, to say you're stronger if you're part of a larger network. And I even think of private investors who've invested in these three countries. They, in their investment, in their projections, in their planification, they're investing in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, because they see ECOWAS as the market, a larger market for their products. And all of a sudden you're telling them they're not going to be able to have access to this market. They can only produce for people in a few countries whose income level doesn't even allow these investors to make profit. What are they thinking? And how do they think this will play even with the private sector? You also cannot at the same time have problems with all of your ECOWAS neighbors, and then you have problems with Algeria that shares a long border with your own country. You can alienate everybody and still hope for stability and security in your own country.
Now, you have monitored elections across Africa. So many nations. I don't know. I can't name all of them. Yes, we cannot. You are always there when there are elections. What is the observation? What is the reading that you give for the elections that are conducted across Africa? And what is the place of elections monitoring? Because you guys monitor, you give your observations, and maybe some of the results are in favor or not in favor of what people expect. Yes. What is your reading of Africa's democracy with respect to elections?
Elections, yes. With regards to elections, the first thing to say is that elections alone do not a democracy make. Okay. And so people have to understand that while elections are an important pillar, in fact, they're the only way by which citizens determine who gets to govern them. And while elections are an important pillar in the democratic process, other institutions have to play their role as well. Other actors have to have their say as well. First accomplishment with regards to elections in Africa, it is now accepted practice that countries have to go through regular and routine elections.
Okay.
That was not the case in the past. I mean, we even had, I don't want to go back too far in history, but we had African presidents who had written into constitutions that will be president for life. You know,
true. Yeah.
we had that on the continent. But now, it is now accepted practice that countries must go through regular elections to allow citizens the right to choose their leaders. Secondly, I would say that elections in Africa, despite their challenges, have succeeded in bringing about peaceful transitions of power in a number of African countries.
Okay.
Between 1960, when many African countries had independence, and 1990, only 3 African presidents had voluntarily relinquished power on the continent. Only 3. Julius Nyerere of Tanzania, Seda Senghor of Senegal, and Amadou Ahidjo of Cameroon. There were only 3 in the entire continent. But what we've seen in this third wave of democratization is that as countries have now adhered to electoral practices, we've seen more and more renewal of leadership through electoral processes. We've seen incumbent presidents that have lost elections and accepted the outcome. We've seen new players that have formed parties and gotten into the electoral process and won elections. We've seen opposition parties who've lost some elections and won some. And so that has now become part of the practice of democracy on the continent, and that's to be complemented. But there's still, at the same time, a lot of work to be done to make sure that elections can be meaningful and credible. If I could just, in a minute, talk about election observation. Election observation is just one component that has 3 objectives. First is to see and report on the electoral processes so citizens across the nation and internationally are informed about that electoral process. It is also to, by their presence, show solidarity with the citizens of that country to reinforce the message that they are part of a global community of democrats, and that in solidarity, Democrats from other parts of the world are also traveling to their country to watch them go through their elections.
Okay, so many questions are coming in there.
Yes,
Doctor,
sorry, being long, you know, that doctor also gives a professorial part to me, and sometimes I tend to over-lecture, but thank you.
Let me take some of them. Good evening, Mr. Liu. I wish to thank you for bringing Dr. Fomunyoh. I really admire what he has achieved so far. Tell him he is my role model in the civil society. Bongo Justin is writing from Bamenda. Good evening, Mr. Liu, and thank you for the wonderful work you are doing. Ask Dr. Fomunyoh, how do we replace a regime that has been in power for decades through constitutional coups? Because I personally think these constitutional coups are the reasons for this military coups in Africa. Elvesta Toba is also watching us from Bamenda. Good evening, Mr. Liu, and good evening to our special guest, Dr. Fomunyoh. My question to our special guest goes thus. With your high capacity in matters of democracy and being a man full of intellectual honesty, how do you feel when the rest of the world tapping from your capabilities while your own country have turned a blind eye on what you have to offer? Ngala Etienne is also watching from Bamenda. I don't know whether the country has turned a blind eye to what he has to offer. We're going to be discussing about that in the course of the program. Hello, Mr. Kum. I'm glad to be part of the citizens' education that is taking place on the point at my media Prime TV right now. My question to your guest, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. My brother, how do you see Cameroon elections come 2025? And what is your message to Cameroonians beforehand that will help change the current situation of the country? Thanks, Mr. Fon. It's watching us from Douala. Good evening, Mr. Liu, and good evening to Doctor. Please, I wish to ask a doctor, how soon will food be sent to the Northwest and Southwest regions to help the people? I'm watching you from Obang. Obang is on the way to Wum from Bamenda. Good evening, Mr. Liu. I wish to ask Doctor, what has he been doing as a citizen to resolve the Anglophone crisis? Mr. Joe is watching from Bamenda. We're going to ask this question now. He's taking note. Special greetings to you, Mr. Liu, and Dr. Fomunyoh, my favorite role model. I wish to thank a doctor for his special time he has taken to come to talk to Cameroonians on the present political sphere in the country. I wish to personally plead to Doctor to use his office to talk to the powers that be in Yaoundé so they can release political prisoners both from the MRC and those in prison for the crisis rocking the English regions in the country. This will go a long way to soften the hearts of many and also pave the way to hitch free, peaceful elections come 2025 and a good path to long-lasting peace in the country. My humble plea. Thanks for having my point. Consul Venatius is writing from the Northwest region. Hi, I have this simple question to Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. You've monitored and provided advice to most African countries, especially in democratic processes. What advice can you give the Cameroon authorities in relations to 2025 elections? Yes, can you try any of them?
Yes, okay. I can answer all of them, but okay. I'll try to be succinct. Yeah. First, may I throw a salute, for my brothers and sisters where they ask this question. Okay. Hopefully, I'll get to see them soon. Okay. But, we'll get to that when we get to the crisis, because that's one of the consequences of this crisis, that people are locked up in their villages or in their towns. They can come out, they can get to meet with others as used to happen in the past. Okay. I really commend the people who are working in civil society and who recognize the critical role that civil society plays in every country. We talked about that with regards to Senegal. We can also talk about that with regards to elections monitoring. When I started doing this work, there were a number of countries where citizens were not even allowed to monitor their own elections. Okay. NDI and a number of other organizations, we were amongst the people who made it a personal fight. And today I am really gratified to say in every country that you go to, citizens mobilize observers in the thousands to monitor their own elections. So civil society, keep it up, keep doing the good work. We're all together in this.
Okay, so civil society, keep it up. That is the message that you're getting from Dr. Fomunyoh, actually in our studios out here in Douala, the nation's economic capital. Emmanuel Binanjo says, I'm watching you live from Yaoundé. Sam Eric says, I'm watching you from Thames Valley, South region. Bon Miko, okay. Chance Kibi says, I'm watching you from Kumba. Net Marion Queen Kara says, I'm watching you from Boya. Biami God of Grace says, I'm watching from Yaoundé. Sorry. Are says, I'm watching you guys from Limbe. But let's look at democracy in Africa. Yes. What is the problem with democracy? That it's been around our corridors for so many, for decades today, but not meeting the aspirations of the people. Is it a wrong casting?
Well, let me first, as a tourist salute, we have an office in Kumba. Okay. Our foundation has an office in Kumba. So when I hear Kumba, K-Town, it touches my heart. And the women in Limbe have been doing a lot of food drives with the foundation. We'll come to the foundation later on. Yeah. And even our friend, the viewer who called from Thames Valley, I know Thames Valley. Okay. People may not know this, but I once drove from Libreville. Okay. To Yaoundé by road. I came by road after the Gabonese elections in 2015, right to Yaoundé, because the planes, the air traffic was disrupted and I needed to be here. Just to say that the continent, I feel the continent and I feel the heart of it. And every time that a country or a village or a town is touched, there's some, I feel just connected to it in many ways. The issue with democracy on our continent, to be very honest, is you cannot have democracy without Democrats. Okay. We've had people who've maneuvered their way into state houses who are not committed to democracy. They've maneuvered their ways into state houses because they want to do like the people they replace. We had leaders who came into power at independence who wanted to do like the colonial masters. They wanted to be treated by their own citizens the way the colonial masters were treated. They kept that distance. And even while countries have had these transitions, we've had leaders who have come to power, not because they want to serve, but because they want to serve themselves. They want to accumulate the public wealth for themselves. And if you don't have Democrats, people who are really committed to democracy at heart, when they get to office, they begin to commit the constitutional coups, like the lady just mentioned, calling from, texting from Bamenda. The constitutional coups, changing constitutions to perpetuate themselves in power, bending electoral rules to favor themselves and their parties instead of having it be an open contest. And so they govern in a way that undercuts democracy, undercuts the independence of the courts, undercuts the space for political parties, civil society, and even the media. And so they put democracy on life support, which then opens the vacuum for every Tom and Dick in uniform to stage the coups. So I think we, the 1.4 billion Africans, have to stand up and remind our leaders that democracy is ours and that the mandate that they get to serve is a mandate that we entrust upon them. And so that's the way that we can guarantee democracy on our country. Democracy is an African value. And I stand up in Washington, in Paris, in London, in Geneva. I say, you know, you can tell me that Africans don't have democracy in their DNA. We do. It is how we are governed. It's the supply of democracy. It's the poor performance of our political elites that gives the impression to the rest of the world that democracy is not our thing. And that's something that we have to correct. Fortunately, there are a number of African countries that are going on that track, and I'm hoping that the more citizens stand out and speak out, the more the message is going to be clear to our leaders that democracy belongs to us and not to them.
Okay, good evening, Mr. Kum. Enjoying your program with Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, our able mentor. Extend warm greetings to him back home. Always glad to hear him live. Willie is watching us from Gaundere. This other person says, good evening. Special greetings to Doctor. I'm watching from, is it Bintam? In Gabon.
Yes, yes. I drove past Bitam.
Okay.
Between Libreville and Ebolova.
Okay. Yes. Hello, Mr. Leo. Thank you for using your platform to impact the lives of thousands and millions watching you all over. Thank you for inviting a political connoisseur, Dr. Fomunyoh. He is quite grounded on the realities plaguing modern societies. Please unveil this question to the doctor. How effective is democracy on the African continent? This is Mr. Nguran, and I'm watching live from Bafia. Thanks. I don't know whether it's Bafia in the center region or Bafia after Muyuka. Yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay, this one says, good evening, Mr. Kum, Dr. Fomunyoh. Thank you people so much for interesting program. I wish to ask Doctor, what's the difference between constitutional coup and military coup? Secondly, what can the common man do when a democratically elected president changes the constitution to die in power while the common man cannot stand up to oppose them? Talk less of casting a vote which would be rigged. Roland Atabong is watching from Finland. Okay. Good evening, and the host of my Media Prime, and to Dr. Fomunyoh. I always like your interviews. In your personal view, do you think the Southern Cameroon Anglophone crisis will end soon? Ferdinand is watching us from Boya. Hi, Kum. It's a pleasure to listen to you and Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. One question. Are elections in Cameroon fair from a democratic one, intelligent man president for plus 41 years? Yes, but we were talking about democracy in Africa, and you say that the issue is democracy is there, it is in our DNA as Africans, but we lack Democrats. Yes. Which means that it's like someone opens up an air agency, air travel, I don't know, an airline company, and lacks pilots. That's what you're saying. Yes. We lack Democrats to be able to implement democratic principles in the interests of the people. But how do we get Democrats into offices? Well,
you do so by identifying the right people who can lead.
Okay.
People who have shown their commitment to leadership, people who in their prayer practice have demonstrated that they care about the common good, that they care about other people, they look out for the less endowed amongst us, they look out for the disadvantaged amongst us, you know. And Barack Obama started as a community organizer. People saw the work that he did in local communities in Chicago, and they said, this young man deserves to be a senator. We'll vote for him when he runs for the Senate, and they did. And then when he got out and introduced himself to the American people, they said, this young man deserves to be president, and they voted for him. So we have to be more discerning in the criteria of the choice of our leaders. It is us that determines that this gentleman or this gentle lady has what it takes to lead people. And if we apply the right criteria in the choice of our leaders, we will not end up where we are today. If we choose leaders based on rather very subjective criteria, then ultimately we shouldn't expect them to perform differently. Because after all, in the previous dispensation, they had no objective criteria to be able to meet the office to which they now aspire or in which they now find themselves. So we, I wouldn't want to blame the victim, but we have a role to play in making sure that when we choose leaders, we choose them based on criteria that would allow them to perform well when they're in the offices for which they're interested.
Okay, Tekwa is watching us from Douala. Good evening to you, Tekwa. Keep the questions coming. I hope we have time to discuss what we have to discuss today, and also take some of these questions. Okay, Bertrand Fomunyoh says watching live from Kumbo. Leonard, happy to see Christopher Fomunyoh in the studio. My greetings should be extended to him. Please, we are in a group asking him about the Anglophone crisis. Okay, they have gathered themselves. They want to know about the Anglophone crisis. Okay, it's a privilege for them to have you on this set. Good evening, Ngwek. Good evening, Mr. Leo. I'm watching from Loom. Kelo Kalusi says I'm watching from Makenene. Emmanuel says I'm watching from Yaoundé. Yes, I'll take two more messages and then we continue with our discussion. Hello, Mr. Liu. Doctor, we all know too much of a thing is an illness, which is a pandemic. I think our head of state has been in power for long and we actually need a change. Doctor, what if he has to win the 2024 elections again? Does it mean we will have to wait for another 7 years? Doctor, I think you have something in mind that can bring an impact. Writing from Bamenda, I'm Umaru Nuzela, writing there. Okay, good evening, Mr. Kum. I'm watching you live from Ngaoundéré. Doctor should keep it up. Samrich, writing from Ngaoundéré there. Love it, Mukete. Good evening to you in the studio. Doctor, thank you for the word of wisdom. I'm watching you from Idina, West Coast for subdivision. They're watching you from across all the villages and
across the globe.
Yes, across.
Yes.
Now, Doctor, let's look at the Cameroonian situation. Where do you situate democracy in Cameroon? Do you fear for 2025, or you think Cameroonians are civic enough to know what awaits them?
No, I do have real concerns.
Okay.
I have real concerns because, we talked about elections. Elections are not just a one-day event. It's not just going and casting a ballot. Elections are an entire process that begins from a pre-election period, voter registration, citizen participation, goes through a key moment in the E-Day, on election day, and then a post-election period. And so if the environment is not right going into an election, you cannot expect the outcome to be perfect or to reflect what people were aspiring to. I already had concerns going into the 2018 elections. Okay. And my position was very open, was very clear. I made it known here in Douala that I had concerns with regards to the overall environment in which 2018 elections were being conducted. And of course, the outcome and the consequences for the country have borne me out. And I'm very worried that at this point in time, with the multifaceted crisis that Cameroon faces, if there's not a genuine effort to tackle those crises, if we keep limping as we've been limping along, and I choose my words very carefully, we've been limping along and losing lives and property in the process. If we keep limping with the additional dynamics that have been raised by some of your callers about the longevity of service of the current holder of that office, we risk, there's a very high risk that we could run into wild winds coming into 2027. We still have 2 years during which things could be done to mitigate that environment and create an enabling environment for open, inclusive, competitive elections. And like every country that's gone through open elections, we would go through it, and a vast majority of Cameroonians would understand that that is a reflection of the will of the people, and they will live with it.
Yeah, that is as far as the organization of elections is concerned. But when you look through the opposition in Cameroon, you see an opposition that is organized, that actually knows what it takes to overcome the current ruling party, because whatever we say, the CPDM will tell you that we won elections through the ballot. Do you see the opposition organizing itself to be able to take the CPDM out?
Well, you know, that's a sub-question that calls into play a bigger question about the state of political parties.
Yes.
Because I don't want to come across as the guy who is beating on the guys that are on the little guy, the guy who's already on the ground. The opposition in Cameroon is trying to survive, is grasping for oxygen in the environment in which it finds itself. I know we will come down to the Anglophone crisis, but you know, in West Cameroon, there was a law that forbids civil servants from being involved in politics.
Okay.
In the United States, that law still exists. It's called the Hatch Act, H-A-T-C-H Act, Hatch Act, named after this senator who spearheaded that movement. The desire being that you need to build a firewall between the government and the administration of the state and political parties. Because that's one way of creating a level playing field for all political parties to contest. And so today, because we don't have that firewall in Cameroon, it's difficult to say, for me personally, whether the CPDM is the political party militant, is the sous-prefet, is the governor, is the prefet, or other auxiliaries of the administration who provide cover and give an upper hand for one political party to have advantage over the others when it comes to political competition. I will hope, I would wish, and I will hope that in the future we can create that fence, that wall, so that each party is based on its merits. And if that party continues to be the majority party in the country, then we will know that it would have earned it, and is not getting additional advantage because of the number of civil servants and ministers that are involved in it. That said, we have seen countries where opposition parties have been able to mobilize themselves by forming coalitions, by engaging with other actors, by reviewing the approach that they take to elections, by coming up with party platforms that have allowed them to be more appealing to citizens, by galvanizing especially the youth who form the majority of the population and are very high-tech savvy and can communicate in today's world, by mobilizing them into the electoral process. And we've seen those parties perform extremely well. Look at what just happened in Nigeria last year. You know, Peter Obi, out of nowhere, relatively speaking, compared to the other political parties that were existing, was able to energize young Nigerians, appeal to them in a way that got the Labour Party to be the third in the running, which means that there's a lot of potential. And what I've said to the Peter Obi people in Nigeria is that this was your first attempt, and you came third place. You had over 12 million votes, which means that by the next go around in 4 years, Nigeria is on a 4-year cycle, your party should be able to do better. So there are many things that come into play with regards to political parties in Cameroon. And I think the opposition still has a shot if it organizes itself, and if there's that level playing field for all the parties with the required amendments, not just in the electoral code, but even in the constitution of the country, that would make the electoral process more attractive, that we could be in for some real competition.
Okay, good evening to you, Nchitu. Fidelis Ebenezer Make, okay, you're watching from Bafia, and Nchitu is watching from Boya. Ekomeli Bonaventure Owasu is watching. Instrument can we use to know, identify our leaders, okay? Abel Fu says, good evening to you, Mr. Liu and Doctor. If we can have just about 10 open-minded and courageous patriots like him in Cameroon, I think we can be sure of change. Keep the spirits alive, okay? You are watching from the United Arab Emirates, okay? Dr. Simon Muzu says he's watching from London right now. Good evening to you, Doctor. We're glad to note that you're watching. Now, We are talking about elections, and you say you don't want to sound like beating the opposition in Cameroon that is already faced with so many challenges. But when you look at the message that is passed on, because we are looking towards 2025, don't you think that the political arena today needs a person like the Obi you talked about in Nigeria, because his coming also brought in persons who never believed in the ballot box in Nigeria? We saw what the Obama effect in the United States of America. Don't you think that in Cameroon today, as we look towards 2025, there is need for persons from out of the current political arrangement to also add their voice and spur Cameroonians to wanting to believe again on the ballot box?
You know, my hope is that the political party leaders, you know, intelligent, they're intelligent people, they're successful. Some of them have been very successful academics, others successful entrepreneurs. My hope is that they too can read the tea leaves, that they too would have to find ways to listen to the population. They can conduct their own polling. They can conduct focus groups to hear from citizens. They can have town hall meetings to hear from citizens what citizens want. And ultimately, as they get that input from citizens, they may be able to sit down and kind of, you know, have a roadmap to success. You first have to define success on paper and see how the math adds up before you kind of toss yourself in the race, if it's a race you want to win. So my hope is that ultimately between now and then, they too would come to the conclusion as to what it takes, and that, you know, you don't just toss your hat in the ring because you want to have a business card that says you also ran. You want to toss your hat in the ring because you want to win, and this is what it means. Or you step out and you look objectively, and you say, in the present context of a Cameroon, given what the country is going through, given its assets, this is the prototype. This is the prototype of what it could take to give Cameroonians a sense of hope, that there's a future, that by investing in the electoral process, you can have an outcome that will be meaningful for you and your family and your life. And that's how you get people back into the electoral process, back into the political process, and that's what could make a difference. My hope is that people are listening and watching and thinking through a lot of these issues so that they approach it not just as a knee-jerk reaction, but as something that they hope they can win, and that could ultimately galvanize the majority of Cameroonians to get into place and compete in that process.
Good evening, Mr. Kum, and to you, Dr. Chris. My question to Dr. Chris is that why can't the African Union and other regional bodies go hard on African leaders or countries that do either military coup or constitutional coup? I quite remember when ECOMOG forces threatened Yaya Jammeh. Why can't that be implemented either through diplomacy, diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, as so the coup plotters can leave? Rodney is watching from Yaoundé, but that was also something that the ECOWAS members wanted to do. It is the public opinion in Africa and across the world that was against moving troops or boats into Niger for that situation. Good evening, Mr. Liu, and greetings to our guest on the host. Tell him to say exactly what is supposed to implement in our country, Cameroon. Shalom to you all. Writing from Yaoundé, Edwin. Good evening, Mr. Kum. Stanley is watching from Kumba, enjoying the program. Good evening, sir. Kum and Dr. Chris Fomunyoh in the studio of My Media Prime. A question to Dr. Fomunyoh. What role has your foundation been doing both nationally and internationally to bring an amicable, just and lasting settlement to the Anglophone war in Cameroon? Paul Eno is writing from Bamenda. We're going to be talking about the Anglophone crisis soon. Good evening, Mr. Liu. I'm watching from Nyengwe in Guzang, okay. This one says, is Chanji Roland, founder and president of Coalition Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Assistance, watching you, Mr. Liu and Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh. I am watching you from Tico. Question: what does Doctor have for Cameroonians with reference to the crisis in the Northwest and Southwest as a pivot of democracy in Africa? Okay, Mr. Kum, And like many other Cameroonians, are convinced that Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh is one of the right persons fit for leadership in Cameroon, and looking forward to him as that Democrat at the helm of the people in due time. Okay. Good evening, Mr. Liu and Doctor. I'm New Dine Bed, writing from Wainama in Kumbo. I wish to ask Doctor if he actually sees any relevance as to the role of the Constitutional Council in electoral processes in Cameroon, given that the existence of the elections in Cameroon. But you are telling Cameroonians that you hope that political leaders read the signs of time and know their capacity to be able to beat the CPDM and take the right decision. But at the level of the civil society, you are someone that many Cameroonians look up to, and I'm sure you are engaging other persons who are not in politics as we speak. Are you talking about Cameroon? Are you concerned? Are you also offering advice? Are you engaging some political party leaders?
Yeah, I talk about Cameroon every day.
Okay.
Because it's my home. This is where my heart is. This is where my navel was buried. It's buried. It's still buried. I talk about Cameroon every day, and I worry. I see these warning signs. And, you know, at various times in the past 30 years, I've flagged issues which I thought ought to be addressed.
Okay.
In 2013, you may remember, I put out a small book, The Cameroon of Tomorrow. Yeah. Simple, written in simple English, in simple French, to raise some of the issues which today are biting us very deeply. And at the time, some people didn't take it seriously. So I worry about these things, and I talk to other people who also worry about these things. The important thing is to have that critical mass. Someone said 10 people, maybe 10 times 10 or more. That critical mass of people who think and mean well for the country, and who can find a way to tackle all of the issues that have been raised, some of which we'll discuss in further detail down the road. But I'm so impressed. This program alone, and we're not even done through the program, this program alone consoles me that there's a depth of citizen engagement out there. There's a degree of awareness out there for people just waiting to be engaged, and whose voices need to be heard. And if our leaders were to pay attention to these citizens at the ordinary level, then we wouldn't have the multiplicity of crises which are today just bringing us down as a country. If I could very briefly talk about the African Union and regional organizations stopping constitutional and military coups. There is an effort. ECOWAS is done better, far better than many of the other sub-regions, including our ECAS sub-region for the Central African sub-region. There's SADC, there's IGAD in the Horn of Africa. Those regional organizations have done well. One thing that has also helped is that in each one of these sub-regional entities, there is a powerhouse. South Africa is the powerhouse for SADC. Cameroon is the powerhouse for Central Africa sub-region. Nigeria is the powerhouse for ECOWAS. In fact, the person made reference to ECOMOG. Nigeria stood and was taking the lead. I've had conversations with President Obasanjo, former President Obasanjo, who's been generous to share with me some of the things he did when he was president, when a number of countries were threatening to do coups. You know, Obasanjo is very abrasive. And he would warn them. He said, look, I know what you're thinking. Don't even dare to go there. One time he flew to Sao Tome and Principe. After they had announced a coup, he flew there himself and said to the military, go back to the barracks. I'm here to say there's no coup in our neighborhood. And it worked. So when the powerhouse is strong, it carries the rest of the countries in the sub-region. I think former President Buhari didn't do very well in foreign policy for Nigeria, and ECOWAS kind of suffered the fact that the Nigerian voice wasn't out there. And a lot of these coups happened while he was waiting, or while Tinubu was still trying to take office in the case of Niger. When the sub-regional organizations don't speak out, when a civilian government is underperforming, they lose, coming back to equity. It's like equitable estoppel, the principle of equitable estoppel. They lose their voice and the ability to speak out when there's a military coup. And so citizens in those countries say, but where were you ECOWAS? Where were you, AU? When this president did this bad thing, when this one did this other thing, you didn't speak out. Why are you speaking out now? And they would have lost their voice in the process. And that's why when the African Union launched NEPAD, you may have heard about NEPAD, we were all very enthusiastic because it was a peer review mechanism. And we all thought African leaders would be out there calling their colleagues to order and saying, don't do this, it's not right. It's going to end up hurting the image of our entire continent. And they've not done that as much effectively as we thought. And that explains why there's a lot of disenchantment. Why 70% of Africans still believe in democracy and democratic governance. Over a majority of them are unsatisfied with the way in which their countries are being governed. And I think African Union, the sub-regional organizations, and African heads of states must stand up and take notice.
Okay, they must take notice, but 2025 is still the focus for this discussion tonight with you. Are you engaging, since you are so much into elections monitoring, are you engaging the elections body in Cameroon? Are you talking to them? Are you also looking at the indicators for a good or a bad elections, drawing inspiration from what you have gathered across the continent?
I certainly haven't begun any conversations with Elekam, but I definitely am looking at the indicators, the positive and the not so positive indicators, and that's why I'm flagging some of these issues. That if we don't deal with the multifaceted, multiple crises that Cameroon is facing today, it would be extremely difficult to go into a meaningful and inclusive election in 2025. So we've touched on the crisis in the northwest and the southwest, and we'll still come back to that. But we're also facing crisis in the extreme north, you know, and the way in which that crisis is being managed can also impact the ability of citizens in those areas to participate effectively in the electoral process. We're having issues with refugee flowovers from the Central African Republic into the eastern region. The way in which those things are handled can also have an impact. We're having issues with our electoral code. A lot of dissatisfaction about the provisions of the electoral code, many of them dating back decades. If something is not done about that, you're going to shut out a lot of people from the process. We're having issues about our constitution and the form of the state. These are all issues that need to be dealt with to give citizens a sense that we're not just going to go through emotions, that elections mean something and your participation means something, because the legitimacy of whoever emerges from there will need to be relied upon to govern the country for the next 5 or 7 years. Okay.
They themselves have not consulted you in any way possible.
Well, so far they haven't, but there are also other organizations. I wouldn't sit here and pretend that they know it all for everybody. As long as they do a perfect job, you know, it doesn't have to be by me. And I know that the leadership of Elekam have made some trips overseas in the past, and I've spoken to organizations that also have expertise in election management. My hope is that they will continue to reach out, because ultimately, at the end of the day, yes, the country has got a president, and we can blame the president for his underperformance or his poor performance. But ultimately, some of these institutions are going to have to be held accountable for their performance as well. And so, you know, we talk about the Constitutional Court. In Senegal, it's being praised. In Cameroon, it's not being praised. Ultimately, that person or the people are not going to hide behind the president when it comes time for citizens to ask the question whether the courts performed well or not. The election commission we saw in Nigeria used to have horrible elections until they had a chairman of the election commission, Professor Jega, in 2011, who conducted one of the best elections that Nigeria had ever known. And he replicated that in 2015, which allowed for the first peaceful turnover of political power in Nigeria since independence in 1961. So an election administration body matters, and how it's run is incredibly relevant to the outcome of an electoral process. But in the case of Cameroon, we're dealing with a totality of elements, many of which would get in the way of a meaningful and inclusive election.
We are in a country of, say, 27, 28 million people. running over 350 political parties? Is it healthy for our democracy? And when you look at the numbers that go for presidential elections, compared with what obtains, are we on a good footing? Or it is counter to what Cameroonians expect? No,
it's almost laughable.
Okay.
To say that you've got 350 political parties. It doesn't make sense. I know that some people have tried to use that as a reference to say how good our democracy is. And so maybe they would say, you know, if we have 175 times the two major political parties that exist in the United States, it means we have our democracy is 175 times better, you know, which is ridiculous. We don't need that. But, you know, it goes back to the point I was making about talking about political parties in the totality of the environment in which they operate. In certain, and there are ways to create that environment for political parties that is objective, and it's driven by platforms, you know, by representation, so that you have meaningful political parties and citizens. It gives clarity of choice for citizens to know what differentiates one political party from the other. You know, and you have many established democracies that are hundreds of millions of citizens, and they've got 3 or 4 major parties, and people can identify this party is very strong on the environment, this one is very strong on the agriculture, this one is very strong on labor, this one is very private sector driven, and that's what makes it easy for citizens to be able to come back to the objective criteria that we were talking about in terms of how do they choose their leaders, what makes a difference between party X and party Y, and why party Y has a better foreign policy or better agricultural policy than party X. In this confusion of over 350 associations, I would even call them associations, that are politically inclined, you can't say how many political parties are effectively active on the ground and how many will be able to contest an election and provide citizens with an alternative of viewpoints on how the country should be run.
Okay. Good evening, sir. Thanks for bringing our elder brother, Dr. Fomunyoh, to the program. Isaac Cletus, watching from Bafoussam. With your wealth of experience, do you think the present regime in Cameroon can be replaced through elections? Okay. Good evening, Mr. Liu, and warm greetings to Dr. Fomunyoh. My question goes thus. Imagine a country where there is a systematic network of corruption and bad governance established for over close to a century. Can we say that Western democracy has failed Africa, and that is high time for Africa to define her own democracy? I would like you to talk about this, but let me take some messages. Yes. Good evening, Mr. Liu. Greetings to you and Dr. Fomunyoh. I think most African countries don't have democracy, but rather Africracy, strong men ruling. Africa needs strong institutions to achieve democracy. Rather, Africa is having more of strong men in the pretense of democracy. Jaff is writing from Bamenda. Hi, Mr. Liu, tell Dr. Fomunyoh that we have identified him to run for president come 2025, and he will win, and see if he will accept, because good people like him always shy away from politics, leaving room now for charlatans. Elvester Toba is writing from Bamenda. Good evening, Mr. Kuman, to you, Dr. Chris. My question to Dr. Chris is that why can't the African Union and other regional bodies go hard on leaders? Okay, I'm sure I took that, but no, let's look at this one who talks about
African democracy.
Yes.
You know, every continent, every country, it's got its traditions, it's got its cultures, and even within each country, regional entities, ethnic groupings, they've got their traditions, they've got their customs. And so there's not a one-size-fits-all. And nobody that I know of is saying to everybody, your democracy must be like the British parliamentary system or the American presidential system. Nobody says that, or the French system for that matter. Nobody comes to Africa and says all African countries should tailor their democracy around what Botswana is doing, or what Mauritius is doing, or South Africa. Nobody says that, you know. So it's important to integrate, going back to the role of citizens and their engagement in the political process. It's important to integrate indicators that citizens can identify with to bring them into that process. But at the same time, we must recognize that we as Africans deserve the same rights and liberties as everyone else.
Okay.
No one can stand in front of us and say, because you're not European or because you're not American, you should have 50% of oxygen to breathe. No, there are certain universal principles, certain rights, certain freedoms that are God-given at birth. So if you have a pair of twins, for example, and one, your spouse or a lady gives birth to a pair of twins, one stays in Cameroon, and the very next day, for a medical reason, the other goes, say, to the United States or to Europe, and then grows up there. Why should one be living in an environment that is hostile and the other living in a free environment? They were born in the same place. So obviously, there are specificities that each country needs to integrate into its constitutional framework, its legal framework, to make its democratic institutions function. But there are certain basic universal values that must be available to every citizen. And the state doesn't have the right to take that away from its citizens. So, and it's not even the state. The state is a mystery. It's a few political elites. It's a few political elites who lock themselves behind closed doors and determine that they're going to screw up the rest of the citizens. But even those few elites want those rights more than everybody else. That's why even when they embezzle money, they take to European banks, because the financial institutions there function by the rule of law. That's why when they have opportunities, they send their kids to better environments, because their kids can live happily in those environments. That's why even some of them go to invest in those countries, because they know that the rule of law applies there. So we should be piercing through that veil of the state, which autocrats use to hide themselves and their cronies, and call them out.
Okay, we should look at this. But now, what would be the advice you have for the civil society and the opposition, given the situation in which Cameroon finds itself? You know how entrenched and solidly grounded the CPDM is. What would be the best formula to be able to stand a chance to overcome the CPDM?
First of all, I should say one thing, and entrenched, because you used the word entrenched, and that triggered for me a line of thought. Entrenched regimes, autocratic regimes, they always look autocratic until they collapse.
Okay.
Yeah, I went to South Africa. It's like South Africa, the comparison of South Africa during apartheid.
Yeah,
and after apartheid.
Yeah.
I went to South Africa after apartheid. I couldn't identify one person who identified with the apartheid regime. Okay. Everybody said, oh, it was horrible times. Everybody had moved on. And so some of this superficial sense of strength
of implantation
it's sometimes pretty superficial, and so people shouldn't be discouraged by that. They shouldn't be impeded by that. They should think creatively about, one, how do you come up with options that are meaningful and credible and that incentivize citizens. I mean, some of your callers have said it. You can sense from their messages that they could get involved if they had meaning, they had reason to believe that their involvement would bear some fruit. Yeah. Secondly, you have to look at the constituencies that so far have not been mobilized into the system. Women form the majority of the population in this country, like in most African countries. They've been sidelined for a very long time. You have to find ways to bring those constituencies into the political arena. The youth as well. The Nigerian experience that we talked about was very interesting, because prior to the last elections in Nigeria, the youth had been very involved in social mobilization. You may have heard about the INSAS movement, which paralyzed Nigeria. It started against police brutality, but then it became an accumulation of social grievances, and it paralyzed the country for a while. The government had to stand up and take notice because of the mobilization of these young people. And then Peter Obi came along and said, okay, I will take your grievances from the streets into the ballot box. And he had a message that resonated with them, and they followed. And so I would say to the opposition and to civil society, continue to mobilize, continue to be creative, be thoughtful, be mindful about presenting alternatives that are meaningful and that make sense, because that could incentivize the populations that have been left out, the women, the youth, to get involved. And then politics is all about aggregation. It's about addition and multiplication. It's never about division and subtraction.
Looks like Cameroonians have overheard the same story, because when you look at the numbers from 2011, pretty similar to what we had in 2018, and maybe 2024, 25, we may still have the same neighborhood of 3-point-something million persons going for presidential elections. Don't you also have the feeling that Cameroonians have overheard the same story from the same political class and are yearning for a different voice that may come from somewhere else to get more persons registered? And when I get so many persons saying that, the doctor, you are a good candidate for presidency in Cameroon, you have impacted so many persons, why not also come and serve Cameroon?
Well, serving my own country should never be a point of hesitation. And there's no doubt in my mind that if I stop what I'm doing, and many of my competitors want me to stop and come help tackle a lot of these crises that have been raised by your audience or your viewers, that if I put my shoulder to the tilt, hopefully I can also make my contribution, like the millions of other citizens that are out there making contributions in different ways. You talk about the voter rolls and the 3-point-something million people who take part in the elections out of a population of 27 million.
Yes.
There's a lot of apathy out there. There's a lot of apathy. And even if you're the party that has won elections, you have to be mindful of that apathy. Because what that means is definitely a signal that your legitimacy is very thin. It's very thin. And that the day that that legitimacy will be challenged, you will have nobody standing by your side. And so you can't understand, you can't explain why in a country of 27 million people, 28 million people, only 3 million people should participate in elections. And so if you go and you look at the percentage of the 3 million that participated, what percentage voted for the party in power, it's very minimal compared to the overall percentage of the country, and that should be a source for concern. My sense is, if there are new messages, new messengers, better organization, you can mobilize the resources necessary to be able to get into a meaningful competitive process and make your case to the people in a way that would resonate with them.
Now, so many persons have been itchy to hear you talk about the Anglophone crisis, or like us to talk about it for some time. I hope we still have time. Yes, how do we explain that it's something that started like a joke? We are 7-8 years into it, difficult to solve. Are we this incompetent? Do we lack people with knowledge enough, with capacity enough to be able to tackle and put a definite end to the ongoing crisis now rocking the southwest and northwest regions for over 7 years?
It's very sad. I'm very saddened by that, because you look back and you feel like saying, those of us who've been out there from day one, who from 2016, 2017, 2018, until date, have been saying this crisis is dealing with grievances that are genuine, that the grievances of Anglophones are legitimate, but that the crisis will never be solved militarily and require a negotiated political solution. We're right. We've been right all along. And in the meantime, we now have thousands of deaths, hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons, well over 70,000 refugees in Nigeria. The country is still bleeding, people are still being killed, property is still being destroyed, positions are being hardened, and there's a sense of alienation between citizens and the state, and even sometimes among citizens themselves. How can you explain that? And it's been 7 years running, and there's still no end in sight, as far as I'm concerned. And these grievances can be resolved. I have seen worse crises, but it takes a government that listens. It takes political elites that listen. Because, it's not because you're a cabinet minister that you have all the solutions. Nobody does. It's not because you're a president that you have all the solutions. No president ever does. And that's why they listen to advice from people who are within their government, but also from people who are outside of the government, who've had other experiences, who can bring those experiences to the table. I am saddened that today, 7 years down the road, people are still dying for a crisis that could be resolved. But I've also said that the only way that I see this crisis being resolved is going through a mediated, negotiated process. Because the grievances are profound. The teachers and the lawyers came up in 2016. But these grievances go back way before 2016. They go back to 1961. And you talk to people who trace that history. And what has happened in these 7 years is that the little kids who didn't even know about the history of the Northwest and the Southwest regions, today know that history. The 70,000 refugees in Nigeria know that history. And if we don't tackle that history front and center in a very bold way, and it can be tackled, if we don't tackle it, this problem is going to live with us for a very long time.
It's going to live with us for a very long time. Now, you live out there in the United States of America and working with many international organizations and structures and governments. If the Cameroonians themselves cannot solve this problem, have they not been disappointed also by the international community?
You know, the international community, yeah, I would say also, I personally have been disappointed with some sections, some segments of the international community. I have been disappointed with the African Union, and I have talked to the African Union who have said to me, they have the principle of subsidiarity, which means that the African Union doesn't intervene directly. The first port of call is the sub-regional entity. And it goes back, so it's ECOWAS for West Africa, it's ECAS for the Central Africa sub-region. And if that first entity doesn't speak, it's that entity that should then say to the African Union, we have an issue here which we can solve, please join hands and help us. That's what they did for the Central African Republic when it had to go through its transition between Bozize and former President Catherine Samba-Panza. The African Union stepped in because ECAS said, we can resolve this, please help us. We haven't done that in the context of the Cameroon crisis because the powerhouse of this sub-region has said to everybody, including the international community, we can resolve this. We can resolve this. There's nothing to see here. It's going to be resolved. There's nothing to see here. In the meantime, people are dying, civilians, as well as our brothers and sisters in uniform. And that's not right. That's not right.
Yeah, but formally, we saw the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres. He came to Cameroon. La Francophonie, they came to Cameroon. Commonwealth, they all came to Cameroon. And at the level of the United States where you live, we had the Congress and the Senate that also made some resolutions. At the level of the EU Parliament, resolutions were also made. Or why are they silent today?
Yeah, that's true. In fact, I remember the Senate Resolution 684, yes, which was very detailed, very thorough, bipartisan. Yeah. At a time when politics, even in Washington, is very polarized. Yeah. The Republicans and the Democrats came together on Senate Resolution 684, which was very comprehensive. The Biden administration is talked about sanctions and visa sanctions, and Secretary Blinken, during his hearing, for confirmation hearing, cited Cameroon as one of the crises that will be a priority for his administration. So you're right in saying that in the United States, in Europe, there's been at one moment early on, there was some attention, but now there's radio silence, so to speak. And I would say two things. One is that the international community is overwhelmed by the multiplicity of crises around the world. We talked about Russia and Ukraine, but there's also Israel and Gaza. What's happening in Gaza, and that's all the multiplicity of crises that are going on that have become a distraction for those of us for whom this crisis is an existential threat. And so we can understand that. The second thing is that it takes two to tango. In the countries where the international community is gone in, and the power of the day has embraced their input, there's been success. Because everyone has come to the table working together, hand in hand, to draw from the expertise that others bring, apply them to the local conditions to look for a solution. That's why you even saw, as late as January 2022, was it January 2020? Yeah, January 2023, or December in the fall of 2022, carrying over into January 2023, when the Canadians made their announcement that Canada would provide a platform. A platform. It didn't say that Canada was going to be front and center. It said Canada would provide a platform for the Cameroonians to get together and sort out their differences. What did we see in the month right after that announcement? We saw a decline in violence. We saw a decline in confrontations between the boys and the military. We saw a ray of hope. People beginning to say, please, there's going to be a platform where these grievances will be addressed. But as soon as the government came out with a statement that said it wasn't part of the Canada conversations, a lot of optimism dried up. A lot of people became pessimistic. All of a sudden, the ray of hope darkened. And see how many people have lost their lives in the 1 year since, just in the last year. And so it takes two to tango. If the powers that be are unwilling to tango, then people say, then why waste your time here? Take your expertise elsewhere where people need you.
Now, if the international community has grown silent, what would explain also the growing silence or signs of fatigue from the civil society in Cameroon? Because compared with the early years of the crisis, we heard so many outcries from the civil society or advocacy calling for an end to it. It's more or less becoming a no-man affair. When people die today, nobody cares about it.
Yeah, which is very unfortunate, and I can't blame civil society because, you know, these are volunteer efforts. People have put their names out there at risk. A lot of them have been harassed. I know a lot of civic leaders, women leaders inclusive, who have been harassed and threatened in very negative ways. And it takes a lot of courage as civil society because you don't have the backing of the military. You don't have the armored cars when you go into villages to distribute food or to talk to women who have been raped or suffered victims of sexual violence. But civil society has been doing that to their credit. But it comes a time when you run out of resources, you run out of support, you yourself at some point begin to despair about the fact that there's a genuine political will to bring this conflict to an end. And, you know, you kind of begin to lose momentum. We shouldn't forget also that a lot of this civil society are themselves victims of the crisis. And at various points they felt abandoned by the rest of the country because there was a hope that whether you were Anglophone or Francophone, if you saw the atrocities that were being committed in the Northwest and Southwest, as a decent human being, whether you're a president, a minister, a mayor, a senior, a general, a senior colonel, or a captain in uniform, or in civilian clothing, that you will raise your finger and say, this should not happen to my people. This should not happen to other human beings. And so there's a sentiment of frustration that the rest of the country didn't get seized with what was happening in the Northwest and Southwest. And so you can understand. But that is not going to get us across the finishing line. We must pick up ourselves, tighten our safety belts, and continue to work on a daily basis as some religious leaders, some traditional leaders are trying to make sure that we can bring this conflict to an end. And the grievances are properly addressed. The grievances are properly addressed. You are an elite from the Northwest regions. We have elites from other divisions and villages, communities in the Southwest and Northwest regions. What do you think the elite are political, administrative, religious, in fact, the elites of the Southwest and Northwest regions, what extra can they do? In fairness to those elites from the Northwest and the Southwest, they are themselves the victims of this crisis. John Gu Foncha was an Anglophone elite. The way he was treated identified in the petition that he wrote when he left his political party, his testament to how he felt. Honorable Solomon Tande Muna was an Anglophone elite. The way he felt when he left the Constitutional Review Commission and wrote about it said something about how he felt in this republic. If the Constitution had not been changed to make of the Speaker of the National Assembly the third personality and not the second, he would have succeeded Amadou Ahidjo when President Ahidjo decided to leave. People see that. Anglophones see the way the microaggression that is being inflicted on the current Prime Minister, the way he's being undermined by some of his ministers. Even fair-minded Francophones are extremely upset. And what do you expect Anglophones to, how do you expect Anglophones to feel? We are a decent people. We are a people with dignity. We are a smart people. We don't deserve this. We don't. We don't.
Yeah, but
we want to compete in today's world. Mm-hmm. And so the people who have caused the crisis cannot turn around and say, you go resolve your crisis. They have caused the crisis. Because the issues are known. The Anglophone grievances are known. They are reasonable Francophones who have come out. The former governor, Aboy Machoy, former minister, former secretary general in the president's office, the only Francophone who was governor of the Southwest and governor of the Northwest, he has spoken out very clearly. The Anglophone grievances are known. When Ahidjo was president, President Ahidjo, he had a commission. The current president was on that commission. Aboy Machoy was on that commission. Former minister Dorothy Njema was on that commission. They have spoken out. I mean, Aboyim has spoken out. The former governor, Ahmad Muhammad, who was governor of the Northwest, he has written books about this issue. Ayangma, Protea Ayangma from the private sector, lawyers have spoken. And so the grievances are known. If they're being tackled, there will be no need to say the extra burden should be on Anglophone elites from the Northwest or the Southwest. Of course, they can help, but you have to give them something to work with. They have to go back to their constituency and say, the reason I'm coming to ask you to come out from wherever you are and to work for peace is because there's genuine peace on the table. The grievances that you had about representation are being addressed in this way or in that way. You have to give them something to work with. If you don't give them something to work with, just carrying the title of an elite would not suffice. So,
they're helpless. Anglophone elites, the funds, they're all helpless, from what you're saying.
You have to empower them. Mm-hmm. You have to make them...
yeah, but
there are many of our funds today who are internally displaced. Mm-hmm. They can't stay in the palaces because they're being harassed.
Who would empower them? Let's talk about this call for an Anglophone president. Is that not also a way for an Anglophone to take francophones and then try to fix some of these issues you just raised? Are you talking? Are you talking about this drive? Because there are even Francophones today who say it is time for an Anglophone to be next president of Cameroon.
Yeah, I've heard a lot of talk about that. Mm. That on the part of those individuals is one way to show the recognition that everybody is a citizen at 100%. There are no citizens, second-class citizens. If that's the case, then let's show it. The proof of the eating, the proof of the fruit pudding is in the eating. Let's see it. Let's show it. We should also remember, that deep down there's a fundamental reservoir of Francophone goodwill that even since independence has always wanted an Anglophone president for this country. Mm. I don't know if your generation is familiar with Zakaria Abendong. Zakaria Abendong in the early 60s was the Secretary General of the KNDP, of Foncha's political party. Zakaria Abendong was assassinated because he was mistaken for, it was an assassination attempt that was aimed at Jongu Foncha. And one of the reasons was because a number of Francophones from the West and the littoral, when Cameroon was going through the reunification process, had believed that there would be an election, a presidential election, that when the reunification happens, there will be a presidential election, and Foncha would compete against Ahidjo, and they would vote, they would work to make Foncha the president of Cameroon because they were already disagreeing with Ahidjo in the Republic of Cameroon which had had its independence before, and where Ahidjo was the head of state. Because it didn't happen, there was a reservoir, there was a lingering frustration with frontier along those lines. Look at the result that late of blessed memory Nijon Fundi obtained in 1992. For a man who did not speak a word of French. Look at the results that he obtained in the western and littoral regions and in other parts of the country. And so if mathematically, you could say that in the best of circumstances, with the right enabling environment, it should be an easy win for an Anglophone whose credentials are well known.
What are your thoughts with this today? Do you think the time is ripe for the next president?
It's more than ripe.
Okay.
An Anglophone can fix this country. Not just because he's an Anglophone, not just because our cultural upbringing has embedded in us certain values of fairness, of justice, of equity and equilibrium vis-a-vis everyone, but also because if it's someone that has the credentials and has proven their worth, they can be able to address the grievances that Cameroonians have across the board in a way to give citizens a sense that they belong, because it's that sense of lack of that sense of belonging that is stirring up some of the conflict that we've discussed in the Northwest and Southwest.
Yeah, but for this to happen, we need also to see unity amongst the Anglophones themselves.
The CPDM could even have a primary within the party to have some of the Anglophones who are in the CPDM to put their hats in the ring and run for the nomination. That is even where you begin to see the recognition. Why has the CPDM not thought about enabling some of the Anglophones who are in that party, who have also worked hard for that party? Why are they not even being recognized within that political party? That's when you begin to show leadership. And of course, then the rest can also mobilize themselves. I'm trying to say that when you genuinely want to see talent, you can see it wherever it is. Okay. And if you don't see it even within your own ruling party, it's not when you're ruling the entire country that you're going to see it.
Okay. We are running out of time. I want us to talk a little bit about your foundation.
Yeah.
Many persons know you as working in maybe Kenya, you are in Senegal, you are in Ivory Coast. You were in Ivory Coast recently.
Yes.
Yes. And not knowing that there is a lot that you are also doing back here.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yes. My foundation, the Fomunyoh Foundation, named after our grandfather, was the sub-chief of Guzang. I had one of my brothers called from Nyeregui in Guzang, and I'm very proud of what the village has done for our whole area in Mogamo, in Batubo subdivision. So the foundation has been existing since 1999. So we're now 25 years in existence, and it's really focused on humanitarian work. That's why before the crisis broke, we've done a lot of food drives. Dr. Willie Tamfu called from Gaoundé, he was part of that whole exercise. We went right to the extreme north. In fact, I was the first high-profile personality who went to the extreme north when Boko Haram was at the peak in 2014, 2015. I had people who were calling and say, "Are you crazy? Why are you going up there?" We went up there. We did all the regions of the north, the Grand North. We even went to Mayo Olo, which is right on the border with Nigeria on the other side of the hill, doing food drives and humanitarian actions, donating books to schools and all of that. So that's really the focus of the foundation. Since the crisis broke, we have a center in Kumba, as I said. We have a center in Bamenda. We have a center right now in Yaoundé that's working with internally displaced persons. We had young girls from the Northwest and the Southwest who, because of the crisis, found themselves in Yaoundé with no relatives and no economic activity, and also no skills. And so the foundation is trying to get them together to provide them some training with the hope that they can acquire some skills and then be able to find a livelihood of their own. We have a radio station in Bamenda that broadcasts a community radio that can help raise awareness among citizens and give them voice. We did the same with the center in Kumba, but because of the crisis, we've become very impeded in what we're trying to do. I should also say that in 2001, there was a controversy about how many refugees were out there, and I read people saying in public media that there were no more Cameroon refugees in Nigeria. And I wanted to go see for myself, under the guise of my foundation, what was the condition of our refugees there. And so the foundation teamed up with another civil society organization, CRRI, that's also being run by a Cameroonian, Dr. Tancho. We traveled to Nigeria. I had people who joined me from the southwest and the northwest, and we conducted food drives through 12 refugee camps in Nigerian border states. And it was deplorable to see the state of our refugees out there. And so those are the kinds of humanitarian things that the foundation does, but it's all in humanitarian work.
The foundation? You get money from, or it's you?
It's right now, it's me and my family. And the foundation has not received any external funding. The funding so far has been from me and family and friends, of course, friends who empathize with what the foundation has been doing over the years, and who also from time to time lend a hand to make that happen. In fact, that reminds me of a project we did in Makalangai, which is in the constituency of the Speaker of the National Assembly. We teamed up with a civic organization in Marwa, and we got sewing machines for women in the extreme north who had to learn sewing as one way of earning a livelihood. And I went to Makalangai, and we had a wonderful ceremony, and we donated sewing machines to these ladies. But because of all this multiplicity of conflicts, it's been difficult to go back and see how well they've done since they got the machines. But those are some of the things that the foundation would continue to embark upon going forward. And I'm so delighted that now we have a national executive director for the foundation, Dr. Elizabeth Tamanjong, who you may know.
The former Secretary General for
the former Secretary General of the SDF, who has a lot of ideas, a lot of energy, and is really a mother to the young girls and the young boys who are now benefiting from some of the foundation's services.
Now, you're very concerned about the Anglophone crisis, and the foundation is also working to assist internally displaced persons, and you have been to Nigeria to also look at the situation of refugees out there. But elections are coming 2025, and the crisis is not yet ended. What would you tell the people in the southwest and northwest regions, especially with this background on the need for an Anglophone to become an ex-president?
Well, I'm an eternal optimist. As you know, with all the challenges that we've discussed during our program, you couldn't continue to thrive in this line of work if you were not an optimist by nature. Because you run up against a lot of obstacles, but you have to keep going because of your firm beliefs, but also because of the opportunities and support that you get from your own people and from people with whom you work. So 2 years can be a short time in politics, but it can also be a long time. And I feel that within 2 years, if there's genuine political will, a number of things can be done. And that's why I made reference to the Canadian process with regards to the crisis, because you need to give people a sense that something is being done. We hear you. Your grievances will be addressed. We're working on them. We're holding meetings about them. And you give them a ray of hope. And so you then say, if only you come into the electoral process, it's one way to make sure that those grievances get addressed. And the proof is we've already gone this far, and you've begun to see the fruit of our labor. So that needs to happen. And my hope is that in the 2 years that are left, we're going to generate that political will. We're going to revive the appeal for everybody, irrespective of their political affiliation, irrespective of their status in society, in civilian life, or in military, to do their optimum best as an individual or as an institution or head of institution to make sure that this crisis is resolved.
I mistakenly forwarded the message to
me. Then I'll read it after the show. But
to a wrong group. Hello, Mr. Kum, to Dr. Fomunyoh. Is that why can't he join the politics and lead this country out of the wars we are into? The government of Cameroon listens to the cries of its citizens only when elections is forthcoming. Dr. Chris, you are a soldier with the ability and capability to save the entire crew. Get to politics and take your people from their woods. Rodney is writing from Yaoundé. And Primus Lanjo from Bamenda, thanks to Mr. Kum and Dr. Fomunyoh for this wonderful program. Thank you very much. And Mr. Coombe, congratulations for always choosing your words. Anglophones can't talk the way Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh is talking. He doesn't want to stand outside the house and talk. He deserves to be in the house called Cameroon or Cameroon. Kindly, I will wish to have his number to talk a few things out concerning the war in the Northwest and Southwest regions. A retired civil engineer, Shuniba Wancha Hans Emmanuel. Okay, I don't know whether it's you'll have his number. Okay, good evening to you in the studio, and Doctor, please continue the work you are doing. I am Sali Musa. I'm watching you guys from Suza. Good evening to you, Sali, and good evening. Mr. Liu asked the doctor to tell us how the two stars became one. What happened? Pa John is watching us from Kumba. I don't know whether doctor is a historian. Hello, Mr. Leo. The question to Dr. Fomunyoh is that, okay, I took that one. They are concerned why you are not joining politics here. Once again, good evening, Mr. Leo and Dr. Fomunyoh. Anglophones crisis. Treating diarrhea by locking the shithole. Oh, no. Your message is not nice. I can't read it. But, Doctor, I'm sure you are staying in Cameroon. It's not too long. You're going, certainly you have a word to Cameroonians who are watching you this night. What is the word you have for them?
I have two words.
Okay.
First is an appeal to every Cameroonian of goodwill, every human being, irrespective of their stature in Cameroonian society, irrespective of their party affiliation, irrespective of whether they're civilian or in uniform. Every Cameroonian who considers themselves a human being should be deeply concerned about the ongoing slaughter of other human beings that bear the same blood in their veins. If we all, each one at their level, show the same concern with regards to the crisis in the Northwest and the Southwest, those crises, or that crisis, will be resolved in no time. My second message is the message of hope, that all is not lost. I alluded to this when I said, darkness always prevails until the sun rises. The sun shall rise. And we will all look at these dark days and wonder what happened to us, but most importantly, grateful that we stayed the faith, we stayed the course, we worked as hard as we could, and today we're in sunlight and brightness. And people should be assured of the fact that the world is paying attention. Their sons and daughters are watching and working hard and finding ways to bring all of this to a peaceful, negotiated solution. And I am confident it will happen.
Okay.
It will happen.
Thank you very much, Dr. Christopher Fomunyoh, who is the Senior Associate for Africa and Regional Director of the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. We're grateful to have had you on the point this night.
Thank you for having me, and congratulations again for your brilliant performance. I'm so impressed with what all of you have done here, and I wish you lots of success in the years and decades to come.
Thank you very much. And to all of you who took time off to watch this edition of the program, we say we are very grateful to you, Desmond and Eli, for production, Tabitha Bryant for supervision. Thank you for watching. Stay blessed. Bye-bye.